Hello and welcome to the Open Air Podcast. My name is Devang and I'm joined as always by Mr. Simon Bushell. Bush, Happy New Year to you. We are not back live just yet, but we did want to resurface one of our favorite episodes from the last year with the brilliant illustrator Tom Humberstone when he talked about his new graphic novel, Suzanne, the Jazz Age Goddess of Tennis. Truly wonderful stuff from Tom, who's just incredibly talented. But one of those episodes, Bush, where I came away from it being like, I learned so much.
All right. You're sitting there, freshly minted from all of that new money that came out of your Christmas cards. Feels like a pretty good purchase, does it not? Going and grabbing a copy of this graphic novel. You can learn about one of the most incredible players in the history of our sport, Suzanne Lenglen, who I think we both learned a huge amount about from Tom, because she's not just a tennis player. She's far more about that. She's a pioneer in so many different areas that she's well worth studying. And I think this book did a wonderful job of breaking down why she is so revered and so loved within the sport, but also in some ways not that well known as well. I think the people that know her really love her and will go to the ends of the earth to talk about how much of a wonderful progressive person she is and the fights that she had and the fact that she's a stout, very fierce feminist as well, which is very cool to learn about. But she's kind of a little bit forgotten in some ways. And I think we touch on that in this interview as well, to learn why that is the case and what her legacy is as well.
It's very well said. And I mean, speaking to Tom, he's devoted a lot of time to this, a lot of passion. That certainly was a passion product, but the product was beautiful. I have a copy of it in my hands right now as we're talking about it. And just the artwork is also just superb. And I think we go in depth about the content as well, but it's just a beautiful piece of work. And we hope you enjoyed this chat with Tom. We also hope you go pick up this book. You can find it at Avery Hill Publishing. You can also request it at your local library, which should be wonderful. So hope you enjoy this look back as we go deep on Suzanne Lenglen. Hello and welcome to the Open Air Podcast. My name is Devang and I'm joined as always by Mr. Simon Bushell with a special guest of ours, friend of the show, illustrator Tom Humberstone. Welcome, sir.
Hi, how you doing?
We're doing great. We're talking about the 20s, the Great Gatsby. We're talking about the original sports icon, perhaps. The person that doesn't get their due today because, I mean, time happens, history moves on, but we were lucky enough, Tom, to get an advanced copy of the graphic novel you produced, Suzanne, the Jazz Age Goddess of Tennis, which is about Suzanne Lenglen, the French icon. Simon and I have both read this, and I just want to say off the top, like, you should really pick this up. Like, before we begin this conversation about Suzanne Lenglen and what she has done and her mark on the game, just full stop. When this comes out in September, get it. If you like tennis, if you like listening to the show, I'm assuming you like tennis. So you should definitely pick this up, Simon. I just want to start with that.
Yeah, and we'll happily take that $5 that Thomas slipped us on the side as well. With great thanks. I should say, more than to be completely honest, it is an astonishing work. I've said this on the podcast before, but like from an artistic and an illustration standpoint, it's obviously excellent. The tone is lovely, but the story as well. Like, I think a lot of people in tennis sort of know Suzanne Lenglen from the court, basically, but she's so much more than that. A pioneer of the sport, someone who we're really excited to dig into because she, I think, holds a really special place within our sport and deserves to be more well known than she is.
Tom, I wanted to start with kind of the how. Like, how did this idea come about? I feel like this sport is so rich with history. There's a lot of angles we can choose to go in terms of who we want to cover, and there's no shortage of trailblazers. But how did you decide to go with this topic?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks for saying such nice things about the book. I really appreciate it. It's one of those weird things when you've been working on a book for, I guess I've been writing and drawing it sort of solidly for the past two and a half years. And I was researching it for a good year or two before that. So it's always a bit of a strange process when I only got to hold it in my hands yesterday, the actual printed copy. And all of this is really new to me. So it's really nice to hear that you enjoyed it. But yeah, I think like you, I knew the name mainly because of Court and I knew that there was the statue. I knew that she was a famous player from the 20s. That might have been the extent of my knowledge, really. I guess it was around sort of 7 or 8 years ago that I started sort of, I've always been into tennis, but I really sort of threw myself into it. I think partly because so I'm a freelance illustrator, but I draw comics, and I draw a lot of non-fiction comics. And at the time, I was drawing a lot of political cartoons of New Statesman about the coalition government, and my partner was involved in the AV referendum, trying to get people to vote for that. And it had been a series of political disappointments. The Tories had just got in again, and I found myself just watching tennis more and escaping into the world of sport. And so I was reading a lot of books at the time, and I was reading Elizabeth Wilson's Love Game. I don't know if you've come across that.
Right.
Yeah, it sort of takes you from the sort of the origins of tennis through to now. It's like a potted history of the sport. And there's a few mentions of Suzanne there, and a chapter sort of about the 20s. And I was just really surprised I didn't know anything about her, considering how big she was, how much she changed the sport, the fact that she sort of arguably changed the way women dressed in the 20th century. You could argue that the reason Wimbledon moved venues to where they are now is because of her. I say arguably because obviously these things aren't all down to one person, but she was like this revolutionary figure in sport. And I think if you asked most people who are into sports, like to name a sports person from the 1920s, they might come up with Babe Ruth. But, she was bigger than him at the time. She was this global phenomenon, and arguably like the first sports superstar. And the more I read about her, the more I just thought that there was a version of her story that I really wanted to read, and I realized it didn't exist. And also like if you come across like when you're trying to like find out more about her, there's like one book really, The Goddess and the American Girl, which is about her and Helen Wills, and sort of so it's broken into two sections, and it's following Suzanne and then Helen and giving you the background, and then it goes into the match of the century, the 1925 meeting they had in Cannes. And there's like an Alan Little book about her, which half of it is sort of match statistics, and it's quite dry. All of that needs to be is very necessary in terms of he had to dig through and find all of that information.
Right. But there was nothing really that was able to like show, because I think that the show aspect of her story is arguably as important as like the winning streaks and the titles she won, in terms of like the style and the changes to the sport that occurred while she was the preeminent person.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was it. Like, the more I realized I wanted to sort of tell her story in a way in which I wasn't finding a version of it that existed, I also sort of realized, if I'm making a comic about this, there are certain things that a comic can do that a prose novel won't be able to do.
Right.
I really wanted to be able to capture, I think, a big part of this, was my excitement for this, was also just being able to like create a love letter to the sport in the medium that I love as well, and try and convey everything that I like about it and the beauty of the game. And then also like it felt like that was going to be the best way to show the sort of vibrancy and the kind of life that Suzanne led, and give it its due as well. I think there's a certain amount of every time that I was reading about her, it felt like there were all of these like scenes that I was creating in my head and writing the dialogue almost as I was reading about her, that a lot of it wasn't coming across in sort of the dry sort of, and in this match, this happened, and this is the scoreline. And I absolutely knew that there's a version of this story that could be incredibly vibrant and dynamic and interesting.
Speaking of that vibrancy, I'm curious, and we can get on to Suzanne for the rest of this episode, but just from an artistic perspective, just looking through your portfolio, I think there is a vibrancy that jumps out to it in terms of your use of color and in terms of just how it kind of pops off the page. What is your kind of artistic background, and what are the things that really inspired you in the way that you draw?
Thank you again. The fiber is definitely in the post. I think it's coming from a lot of different places. I think I've always been a big fan of film, and there are certain cinematographers I've always been interested in. I think certain cinematographers who use color in a particular way, but has always been interesting to me. I think, when I was a teenager, I think the Virgin Suicides might have come out, and I remember reading an interview with Coppola over the different photographers that were inspired the look of that film. And I watched a lot of Wong Kar-wai films, and I think there's a lot of that kind of neo-noir sort of lighting that has worked its way into my illustration work. I also grew up sort of reading a lot of Tom and Klaus and, those sort of 90s alternative comics people, which I think is definitely, taken, you can see part of that in my style, I think. Mm-hmm. I always think of, I think it was Conan O'Brien doing a valedictory speech where he's talking to these graduating students about how he was trying to, now I'm going to get all the different late night hosts' names wrong. Essentially, he was trying to ape the style of the person before him. That might have been Letterman. And then the guy...
Jay Leno, probably? Maybe Jay Leno. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, yeah. And then he was obviously trying to be the guy before him, and all of their sort of own unique styles came out of their failure to ape the style of the person before. Right. The thing that made them unique was all of the things that they were trying to do and failed at, and they found what they were, So I think a lot of my style is a lot of failures of trying to copy all the people I liked, like Alex Toth and Klaus and Tom and obviously, like, more recently, like, I really liked Hope Larson, and at the moment Eleanor Davis is a huge influence but I can't draw at all like her. So it's, I guess, it's just like a mishmash.
I think we're at that kind of weird period as well where graphic novels are having a moment as well. Just, you've seen the success of Heartstopper and Alice Oseman's work, just obviously with the Netflix series kind of having some crossover appeal, and just the success of that graphic novel and finding a really strong home within the queer community as well. So, like, I think this comes at a really good time in that regard, because I'm a huge fan of the medium, a huge fan of the art style and everything. So I'm really excited to see tennis represented in that capacity as well.
Yeah, likewise. I think the idea of sports books within sports graphic novels is quite rare at the moment. I think a lot of comics creators and a lot of comics readers might, this is this huge generalization, but I think I've definitely anecdotally spoken to a lot of comic creators who have absolutely no interest in sport, and I think possibly almost defined, like as a group, we defined ourselves against sport and jocks, and there's that sort of geek jock sort of dichotomy. But I think the thing that unites everyone, both sports lovers and readers of comics and things, is this love of narrative. And I think it's just a question of, like, providing those narratives and showing how exciting and how fun they are, and that will, like, really get people on board.
In terms of the process of creating this book, Tom, like, I have to imagine just a ridiculous amount of work, of course, but did you travel to the French River? Did you travel to Wimbledon? How were you able to? Because I think what was one of the most impressive aspects of this book as well is just the detail. Like there's just a ton of detail and the artistry jumps off the page, but to actually go through the copy and go through the text, there's a lot in there. So I'm imagining that's a lot of time in these locales absorbing these kind of things.
Yeah. There was like an early trip. Like I spent a week with some friends in Antibes and Juan-le-Pin, and like a day trip to Nice, and took as many sort of reference photos as I could. I was able to get access to the Wimbledon Library archives. So I spent like a couple of weeks just sort of going to the Wimbledon grounds, which is incredible when you're, I guess, Simon, you might have also grown up. I don't know when you moved to Canada, but like sort of growing up watching the BBC and Wimbledon on your TV, right, for your entire youth, and then you get to sort of see it when it's got no one in it. It's quite a sort of, I guess I was starstruck by a venue that we're building. So yeah, I got to spend a couple of weeks in the archives going through. They were kind enough to sort of dig out like old letters that they had in the sort of collection that wasn't out part of the sort of main museum pieces, and they've got an incredible resource. Like everything that's sort of been written about tennis in articles and periodicals and newspapers is all collected in scrapbooks and files there. So it's a great resource, because obviously I didn't want to just rely on the fact that, I mean, there were like 2 books about Suzanne, and then, there'll be chapters in like Ted Tingling's book or Bill Tilden's book. And the problem is, spoilers for a real life person. She died when she was 39 and she didn't get to write that book that all these other players got to write. Like she never really got to tell her own story. So it's really, I was really hoping I could contact someone who was part of her estate, who might have like had diaries and letters that hadn't, I never was able to get that far. And so you're just trying to pick up as much as you can from as many different sources and try and piece together a version of her life that feels true, and then slowly piece together. Because it's a funny thing about telling someone's story and someone's life story is, you're probably thinking about having seen Elvis and stuff. It's like you've got these ideas about the person, and then there are certain things that their life means to you, and you have to start figuring out, okay, I can't boil someone's life down into 200 pages of a graphic novel and tell everything about their life accurately. So I need to figure out what it is about their story that first attracted me to telling that story, and what are the themes, what are the things that I want to convey, and start sort of piecing together a structure out of that. And then all the research was feeding into that, but it was also, I was allowing it to change my initial ideas. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't sort of, all of this wasn't set in stone, but I was, sorry, a little tangent, but I was watching the documentary about the making of Hamilton, and Lin-Manuel Miranda is talking to composers whose names are completely out of my head. Gilbert and Sullivan? Is it Gilbert and Sullivan?
Gilbert and Sullivan are composers, yes, but whether or not he was talking to them, I don't know.
No, yeah. Are they alive? More to the point.
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I only know Gilbert and Sullivan from the sort of stranger logic that a lot of people who were born in my era.
I think they're dead. I think they're...
sometime in Burma. Oh God, this is a terrible tangent. My point was, they were talking about writing a musical based on historical research, and they were all talking, the 3 of them, about how important it was to continue to do research, and then at a certain point, you're just procrastinating, and you have to start writing the thing.
Right.
I was very conscious of not falling down that rabbit hole, and and letting the research take over completely. So, yeah.
Tom mentioned those themes that he covers in this book, and we're going to get to them right after the break. Welcome back to the Open Era podcast, back with Tom Humberstone talking about the incredible graphic novel coming out in September. You can get this at Avery Hill Publishing. The link is in the episode description. The book is called Suzanne, subtitled The Jazz Age Goddess of Tennis. We talk about tennis greats. We had the Open Era Hall of Fame that we just unveiled a few weeks ago, in which Suzanne Lenglen was part of the inductee class. Tom, the themes that you cover are wide-ranging, and I think a couple of weeks ago we talked about what Suzanne meant for the sport in general and the professionalizing the sport and becoming a celebrity bigger than the sport. And I think one of the most interesting aspects throughout, and something that I found myself coming back to, was how things really do repeat themselves. And the fact that what we saw Suzanne go through and her arc and how she became bigger than life, I feel like we've seen this in recent times as well from some recent tennis stars.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things that really sort of jumped out at me about a lot of the things in her life was how many parallels you can draw to today. That was a big thing, and I kept on trying to draw attention to it subtly in the graphic novel without being too obvious about it. But yeah, like obviously the kind of the cliche of the father, like the domineering father coach figure, is a perennial story in tennis, and particularly in the women's game, it seems. But also, like, for me, the touch point was reading Open, the Agassi book, and his relationship with his father, and how he couldn't necessarily separate his feelings about the sport from his feelings about his father. And yeah, I think there's a lot of that in Suzanne's story. Obviously, the way in which the press, a big figure in her life and the lives of all the modern players, and how navigating that takes its toll on people's mental health. And you've got the GOAT debates, and then, amongst all that, you've also got all of this socio-political context of, this is all after the First World War, and how society's changing in that. You've got the fact that people needed sport and needed something to take their minds off. There's a lot of trauma in the 1920s, and sport sort of like is almost like a convalescence,
Right?
It's a bit of self-care for everyone.
I think when diving into themes, I think everyone's approach to Suzanne Lenglen is slightly different, because depending upon where you sit in terms of your interaction with the sport, I think you can read different things into her, or your approach into her story will be different. And I think that's what's fascinating about the way that you presented this inside of the graphic novel, because I approached her story from definitely a political standpoint. Like, I knew her as an activist and as a feminist, and someone who pushed the game forward from a professional standpoint, from a fashion perspective, from a comment perspective, from the way that she quotes and held herself, and all those sort of things which have stood the legacy of time and stood the history of time. But I think one of the most fascinating parts about this is you could also approach this from the fact that she was just a bloody incredible player, like just one of the greatest players to ever play this sport. And I think that is a really interesting debate about her legacy overall of how people approach her in general. So I wonder if those two sort of different prongs came into your mind when you were trying to write about this from a thematic standpoint and how to portray it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so tricky. Like, there were so many things that the book, once I realized what I was going to be focusing on in the book, how many things have to sort of slot into place as well. Like, when you're talking about a trip to America, you want to place it in context of, this is during Prohibition. She was drinking during her matches. They had to sort of, the USTA, wanted to tempt her over to play. And so, they managed to break Prohibition in order to supply her with brandy. There were, when you're talking about the way what she wore on the court, you then have to talk about the fact that everyone was wearing corsets before that. And, the women were playing in whalebone corsets, before Suzanne, sort of made the big splash in 1919. And that also happens to be sort of, alongside the suffragette movement. And so there's so many sort of like tracks that you have to sort of lay in front of you as you're, and not least, you sort of want to make it sure it's accessible to people who aren't fans of tennis and don't know anything about the sport. So there are various things that you have to sort of put in there, as well as. So what I realized is I broke the story down into 4 or 5 key matches, and then the conversations that were happening before and after those matches. And then those matches generally would tie into the theme of a chapter. And that's how I broke it down. And each chapter title has is named after a nickname that Suzanne was given, which is why the book is called Suzanne, because I wanted it to be about her. I wanted to make sure that I recentered the story on the person at the heart of this, and that this was a human being amongst all of those other things. That you do have like this legendary sports figure and this icon, this fashion icon, and someone who's sort of known for being sassy and throwing tantrums on courts and getting into arguments with lines judges, and then also is also a person. And so I wanted that to be sort of front and center as well, which was ultimately, I tried to give her an arc, which is that everyone in her life, predominantly men, had ideas about what she should do and what she should achieve at the beginning. And hopefully by the end, we've sort of worked through to a point in which she gets to have more agency in her life and is doing it for herself, or has at least figured out why she enjoys it or whether she enjoys it.
Tom, I'm curious on one really specific point of this. I wonder how she herself, if obviously I can't ask this question, but just during the course of the research and sort of the background to this, I wonder how she would present herself as she made it into the latter stages of her career. If she would describe herself as a tennis player first, or whether she would describe herself as a feminist or an activist first, just given the way that, I mean, you're talking about some of those things, that those are massive structures that she's thumbing her nose against or saying no to or pushing back against. Like the idea of saying no to the idea of the USTA into the country of the United States in a time of prohibition. These are enormous institutions that are bowing down to you in some capacity. The same thing is true with the monarchy as well, like having the guts to say, like, no, I want to play a match at a certain time, even though this didn't happen. But that wasn't something that was done at the time either. Like these are colossal institutions. So I'm just kind of curious, like if she was answering the question, do you think she would the first thing out of her mouth is that she was a tennis player first and then an activist second, or the other way around?
Yeah, it's interesting. And this is very possibly just a projection, like my feeling is a lot of that front that she had when she was talking to reporters and giving press quotes was a mask and a coping mechanism, a way for her to navigate the immense fame that she had when she was, essentially since the age of 14. I think she enjoyed the limelight, but I also think it was taking its toll. The thing that always struck me was in like Ted Tingland's book about the seeing her like these. I think he describes it as like like walking around with entourage that would sort of change on a week-to-week basis, and having these sort of fake peals of laughter, and then he would see behind closed doors she would be, throwing up and sort of age a few years as soon as she closed the door. And I feel like a lot of her pushback, I'm interested in whether or not she would actually think of herself or describe herself as an activist.
Because I feel like the confidence or the things that we can see through the winning column display one thing, but then the actual actions, and I think they're depicted vividly in the book, and like she's drinking cognac during matches, which I don't think is just like a flourish of like, this is her personality. It's like, I got to get through this, and like needing to exit matches in certain ways because she just couldn't deal. And the fact that her dad and her parents are basically commenting on her abilities throughout her matches could obviously leave, I think, some pretty lasting scars. And I think the tragedy that she did pass away so young as well at 39 is another one of those themes, Sonnet, I think I that stuck out for me, is this striving, the seek, or the ability, or the want, I guess, to seek to be the best at any cost. Though she did have other interests, I think was also maybe this source of some discomfort for her as well. I guess weighing the idea of being so incredibly dominant and so incredibly good, and then having to encounter times like you chronicle when she wasn't, or when she did lose, or when she wasn't healthy. It's a vivid portrait, I guess, of what maybe we don't see that's going through the minds of players today as well. Because I think a lot of these same issues, I think of Naomi Osaka when I read some of these chapters.
Yeah, likewise. I even thought a lot about, like how people talk about like Federer as the sort of, the genius who doesn't need to practice, and Nadal's the grinder and the hard worker, and obviously the truth is that everyone is putting in a lot of hard work, and it's just, maybe one style looks like it feels effortless, but that sort of idea of the myth of the the natural born genius definitely feels like, we were having that same conversation in the 20s in that sense, like that, they were trying to, definitely Suzanne's father was trying to create the idea that, oh no, she was just born like this. I just, just put a racket in her hands and she just started playing. Yeah, I find that really fascinating, because clearly I think that idea of she was just naturally going to win, she felt the need to sort of keep that facade up as well. And I think all of it was sort of taking its toll,
Right.
We talk about Swiatek's winning match streak recently, and how I bet it was a relief when she lost at Wimbledon to an extent of it. I got the feeling that I would just be with every match afterwards, that each one, the sort of pressure would start to build up. You know what I mean?
Right, 100%. And I think you could tell no issues talking in press afterwards as well. It was like a weight had been lifted. And I think there's moments in this graphic novel as well where I think you can see just there's a lot of relief involved. There's a lot of maybe not winning, but surviving. And that means different things to different people. Bush, you posted some video clips in our notes this week, and just watching her play, I mean, this is a unique style here, Bush. I don't think anyone's hitting backhands like this today, but the technique, the doggedness, the chasing down balls, I mean, you're seeing the hallmarks of a great player.
Well, I think this is something that I was curious to ask you, Tom, about as well. Just like her training's unique in certain senses, right? Like just her overall athletic ability, coming back to that question of a presentation being put out there of someone that is just naturally gifted and just rolled out of bed and was able to do this. Like, no, she worked incredibly hard. In fact, so hard in some capacity that you could point at saying this maybe is negligence by her parents, almost certainly in that capacity. But yeah, like that sort of ballerina-esque style, certainly the aggressive style, from the fact that she's much more likely to approach the net. You can see it, even in the grainy black and white footage when she's playing in the 20s. This looks like a player who all the hallmarks are there for a modern day tennis player. And I use that in quotation marks simply because obviously technology has evolved and everything else has gone with it. But she looked like a supreme athlete with an incredible brain who was hyper aggressive on court in terms of her style. And I think that would translate incredibly well to the modern day era.
Yeah, totally. I think contextually, the women's game was, I think, a lot of baseline rallies, and that was generally speaking, that was how most people were playing, and that was the big sort of revolutionary aspect of her game. Is I think Charles Lenglen father was encouraging her to play like how the men played, come to the net more. Her serve looks pretty similar to modern players' serve. I think, a lot of the service motions on the women's game a lot of it was underarm serve still at that point. So it was just this huge change that completely dragged the game into the modern era. And yeah, the biggest rivals, I think, were people who were overpowering her by, doing the same back, hitting the ball harder than she was able to. I think certainly that's the case with, I think, Helen Mills and Mola Mallory were both hitters of the ball. They hit incredibly hard. Well, for the time, I've no idea. I don't know whether there are stats on that. But, yeah, totally changed the way people played it.
There's heroes in this book, obviously. Suzanne, I think, is the main hero, but I think there's other interesting characters, people along the way. I wanted to point out a few of them when we come back after the break, as well as go through maybe some closing thoughts on Suzanne Lenglen, and as well as this wonderful book by Tom. So join us after the break to wrap up this week's show. Welcome back to the Open Era Podcast, joined this week by illustrator, author Tom Humberstone, who's written this wonderful graphic novel, Suzanne, coming out in September. I didn't want to dwell too much on the tennis aspect, which sounds bizarre because we're talking about a tennis star and someone who literally rewrote the record books and has one of those Wikipedia pages where when they're broken down, there's little side notes like started of 179 win match streak. Like that's a side note that is basically a bullet point in what is an insane career. So it does sound weird that I didn't want to focus too much on her on-court exploits. But I think one of the fascinating things I found about this book, Tom, is like we see tennis displayed, and I think the fact that you revolve these moments around the matches is key, but we get the before and after, and we get to meet some characters who play larger than life influences on the game as a whole as well. And I think one of those people that we meet in the book is Bill Tilden, who, if you read about Bill, generally kind of a dick, if I don't mind me saying this. I think we can all agree, kind of an asshole. I don't think there's any shocking comment there, but I found Lenglen's approach to these people, the people who clearly were against her and not on her side, and her approach to the people who were in her inner circle and the people who were ride or die with her was fascinating, because I think what we also kind of see still is that you trust who you trust. And I feel like in this society as well, the fact that she was bigger than tennis, she had people maybe not coming after her, but people not supporting her exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was important to me when I was figuring out who the antagonists of the book were and the antagonists of her life were, that it wasn't the players on the other end of the net. That I knew that I wanted to be really fair. I mean, I wanted to be fair to everyone in the book as much as possible, but I didn't want Helen Wills or Dorothy Chambers or any of her opponents to be cartoon villains in any sense. Mm-hmm. I wanted you to be able to. I wanted the reader to root for Suzanne and want her to win those matches, but for different reasons. Not to beat those people, but to make sure that she could win against the press or win against the institutions of tennis. I think a lot of the men in charge of tennis, whether it's the reporters or the tournament organizers or various institutions, to me were the baddies. And I guess, that sort of feels appropriate to the way I almost feel about tennis as a fan, as someone who watches it. It's I love the game. The structures around it frustrate me a lot. And there are so many things around that really sort of dishearten me, but nothing takes away from the fact that, currently Swiatek and Garcia in a third set battle, and I'm really interested to see what happens. Yeah, I wanted the book to make sure that it was like a real love letter to tennis in that respect. And yeah, also I wanted to make sure that most of the antagonists, if not all, were men. And that felt appropriate. I didn't want to let Suzanne's mother off the hook either, though. Both of them were incredibly tough taskmasters by all accounts. And I wanted to make sure that was represented in the book as well.
It's a perfect segue into what I was going to ask, because if we're talking about the cast of characters around, I think so much attention gets drawn to Charles Lenglen in terms of his oversized presence and some of the things he said and the interactions. But I quickly circled in my notes on Annie, on the mother, just to get a sense of, on the one hand, you don't become a feminist figure without important women in your life, I think, presenting certain characteristics, or at least people around you. Whether or not that was her mother, I'm not sure. And I think this was a question that I was keen to ask you as someone who's dived into a lot of the research, is that what was that relationship with her mother like? Because you get the sense the one with her father wasn't great. Was the mother not great either?
First of all, I just want to say thank you for actually doing the French pronunciations properly. I feel like I'm really letting the side down on that. So yeah, just apologies to anyone who's French who's listening and my sort of anglicization of everything. But yeah, I found her relationship with her parents really interesting and very difficult to research. Essentially, like there's so little to find out about Anne, and obviously, like Charles is, like there's a lot more written about him, but also he made a lot more like quotes, and he was quoted a lot more often. So there's much more about him. And he's a figure in the background when you're reading accounts from like Ted Tinlin or various other people who were part of like her entourage or sort of around them at that time. So you get these little glimpses, little things that the fact that she was in the stands with a Belgian Griffon dog, something about that image really made me think of Bianca Andreescu and Coco. And they were both shouting from the stands, getting into arguments with each other about the way in which Suzanne should be playing, getting into arguments with her, shouting from the stands constantly what she should be doing. A lot of off-court coaching going on. Yeah, and then there was obviously a lot of love there as well. I don't want to sort of discount, like you say, there's a lot of negligence, but also as much as I can tell, Suzanne loved them to the end and had a really complicated relationship with her father in particular, and I didn't want to completely avoid referencing that, it wasn't going to be as simple as moving away from him and finding her own independence. They part ways as like he's no longer her coach and manager, but towards the end of her life and her career. But her father's death, as you would imagine, profoundly affected her. And it was just important to me to make sure that they came across like real people and had real relationships with their daughter. And like I say, I guess, they weren't cartoon villains.
Even though Charles wasn't a great dude and you had reasons to root against him, I still shed a tear in the scenes when he passes and Suzanne is bedside and they're having a last chat and they're joking and they're able to find some common ground like they were able to. It wasn't all strife, but I think that balance is key in telling these stories as well. And I think we've seen it across the spectrum in tennis as well, because it's still happening. Like you've mentioned a few times, I think the themes go on. I wanted to go back to some of the tennis stuff in the sense that I think her rivalries and like the players she played, Tom, and the fact that you chose the route you did. Like I think Elizabeth Ryan being such an important figure in her life as well, and the friendship they had, and how important that was for Suzanne, as she was often competing by herself and being alone in the individual sport, and yet I think lifted by her peers. I think it wasn't completely smooth, and I think there was also some cultural divide as well. But I found that aspect as well very fascinating.
Yeah, some really good quotes, that Ryan has about Suzanne in terms of, she was a ham, in a theatrical sense. But, she really, I think she even says, that came from being so famous and so successful from a young age and having to deal with all of the pressures that came with it. But, she sort of really played up that sort of figure. So for me, it was really important that there was Suzanne had these quite large entourages around her, throughout, her time, on the Riviera in particular. And I guess in the book, the choice I've made there is that her entourage is a lot smaller, and you've got Coco Gentien, her parents, Ted Tinglin becomes part of it, and Ryan is often there as well. And I wanted to sort of almost like a lot of these relationships or amalgamations of a lot of different people. I mean, I don't think they ever do or say anything that they didn't or wouldn't have. But I'm sort of like, I wanted to personalize and make sure there was a face and a name that you understood in her sort of inner circle, because we could then see behind the scenes for Suzanne through these people and know who they were and what they meant to her. Yeah, Ryan is such an interesting one in terms of, they had this long-term doubles partnership, and it seemed incredibly close. It really upset her, Suzanne, when she was sort of forced to break that doubles partnership at Wimbledon. So Ryan was someone that I was able to at least do a bit more research on. And there was like a Desert Island Discs that I was able to find, like an old BBC archives with her on there. No, I was able to actually find out a lot more about her because she got to live until much later, and just long enough to see Billie Jean King break her record. And
yeah, it's man, there's so much that we haven't even got to do. We haven't even gone to Jean Bateau or anything around the fashion elements of this, and truly one of the pioneers of anyone, regardless of just fashion in general. Interesting thing about Jean Bateau, as I discovered through the research of this, man who first apparently invented sun cream, or sun tanning lotion, which is fascinating in its own right. I just wanted to ask sort of one last question to you on my side. I think she's a fascinating quote. I think she's one of the best quotes in the history of tennis. I think she has one of my favorites, which is, "My method? I don't think I have any. I just throw dignity to the winds and think of nothing but the game." So wonderfully poetic and so wonderfully French in so many ways. And I think I wanted to sort of my final question to you is, if you had to sort of summarize Suzanne Lenglen in one sentence, just concisely, what do you think her legacy is, and what, or more in particular, how is she important to you through all of this, and what impression has she left on you in particular?
Oh God. Yeah. I'm going to struggle to come up with a good sentence.
I'm a tough interviewer, Frost Nixon style.
In terms of the lasting impact on me, I don't know. I've lived with her and her story for the past 4 or 5 years, and I'm not entirely sure I know what the answer to that question is for me at the moment. I think I'm still in it, in terms of this is one of the first times I'm talking about the book to people other than boring my friends about it. And yeah, I'm still figuring out what it all means to me. One of the things that was quite interesting like my dad died while I was working on the book, and so her relationship to her father, like we had absolutely nothing. There was no relationship similar to the way Suzanne and Charles related. But I found that sort of found its way into the book in some ways. That's not really the answer to the question, though. What did Suzanne mean to me?
But I think that's an interesting tidbit in its own right, especially when you're going through the research and seeing the person that you're studying reflected back in your own relationships as well. I mean, I think we all do that to a certain extent in our line of work, is to see that those elements sort of taken into our personal lives. So I think that's a fascinating insight as well.
Cursor single sentence request.
I'm sorry.
It's a bold question after going through a dense book. You didn't ask me this, Simon, but I'll say this. What Suzanne meant to me after reading this was like, this echoes what I was saying in the Hall of Fame show. And you learn a lot in tennis. And I think you learn a lot about things you didn't watch live. And the game is just the game. There's sets and there's points and there's break points and there's aces. And I get that. But I think so much of this sport, I think I came to learn about was way after things happened. And I think this is obviously one of those reasons, or one of those examples of that. And I feel lucky that I was able to learn about her through Tom's book, because truly, I think read the first-hand sources he mentions, and I think those are all extremely worthwhile, of course. But there's a way to pair the imagery with the story that I think is so rarely done in sports, and I think it's just an amazing vehicle to show people a side of this game that they don't get to see that often. Introduce people who might be skeptical even about the artistic merits of sports, quote unquote, and show them this, and I think they'll be convinced. Because I mean, it's an incredible tale, and I think I would just echo what I said off the top. Go get this book when it's out in September, Tom. Any other advice? It'll be out at Avery Hill Publishing in September. Any other way to get this when it comes out?
Yeah, one thing, Avery Hill are a small publisher, so if you've got like a local comic shop or library or bookshop, do just tell them like you're interested in reading it and ask them to order a copy in. That would be amazing.
It's a huge shout. The public library. I'm going to do that as soon as I can, because I have to renew my library card as well. Great reminder. Go to your library, request this book. Simon, anything else before we throw to Tom to wrap up?
Support public libraries, everyone.
Tom, anything else on your end? Thanks again.
Seconded on the supporting public libraries. No, I think that's it. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me about it. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure was ours. A reminder, we are on Twitter at OpenEraPod. Follow us there. We're also on patreon.com/OpenEraPod. Get the show early on Sundays, get it ad-free, and also join the Discord. For producer Greg on the ones and twos, and for Tom and Simon, thank you so much for listening to Open Era. We'll talk to you next week.